The airplane cabin was filled with a scream that pierced through every row, every seat, and every heart on the plane. A tiny baby's cries bounced off the walls and rattled the nerves of everyone on board. No one could stop her. Not her father, a billionaire with more money than anyone could imagine, nor the flight attendants who tried every trick in the book. The baby's cries were loud, sharp, and relentless. Passengers were covering their ears, frowning, whispering to each other, wondering how a child could scream so fiercely without stopping. And then, something extraordinary happened. A small hand, rough and calloused from work, reached for the baby's tiny fingers. She paused. Her wide eyes locked onto the boy's, and slowly, miraculously, the wailing lessened. Her cries became soft whimpers. The tension in the cabin lifted slightly, but the adults were still staring, mouths slightly open, unsure what had just happened. Who was this boy? How could someone so young and so poor calm a billionaire's baby when money and toys had failed? The question hung in the air as the plane continued to hum steadily above the clouds, and all eyes were on the quiet, small boy whose hand had reached into the storm of screams. Before anyone could even ask, the plane hit turbulence. Drinks spilled, people gripped armrests, and the lights flickered. The baby whimpered again, uncertain. The boy's hand hovered in the air, unsure if he should touch her again. Every eye in the cabin was on them. The moment stretched, tense as a tightrope. Then, the baby's fingers twitched, and she reached for him once more. But that was when the real danger struck. A sudden jolt shook the plane violently. Passengers gasped, a few screamed, and the baby slipped slightly in her father's arms. The boy's eyes widened. Would he reach her in time? Could he calm her before disaster struck? And just like that, the story paused, frozen in suspense, leaving everyone wondering what would happen next. To understand why this small boy had such power over the billionaire's baby, we have to go back to the very beginning, long before the plane, the turbulence, or the cries. Welcome to stories where wealth meets humanity, and every moment reveals the unexpected. Subscribe now for more powerful billionaire stories that will move and inspire you. It all started in a small town in Ohio, where an old woman named Mrs. Evelyn lived alone in a little house at the corner of Maple Street. She was known for her kindness, her warm smile, and the way she always made time for anyone in need. Children loved visiting her because she always had fresh cookies and stories about the magic in people. But it wasn't magic that made Mrs. Evelyn special. It was the way she taught kindness, empathy, and the importance of looking at life through someone else's eyes. One cold morning, a young boy named Jordan walked past Mrs. Evelyn's house. He was thin, his clothes worn, and his sneakers were patched in multiple places. He was carrying a small bag of groceries for his mother, who was struggling to make ends meet. Jordan had heard about Mrs. Evelyn's famous stories and asked if he could come in for a cup of cocoa. She smiled warmly, brushing the gray hair from her face, and invited him inside. Inside the cozy little house, the smell of fresh bread and cocoa filled the air. Jordan sat down, and Mrs. Evelyn offered him a plate of cookies. "You know," she said softly, "kindness is the strongest magic of all. A small act of care can change someone's entire day, maybe even their life." Jordan nodded, listening closely. He didn't know it yet, but those words would guide him into a moment that no one on that plane could ever forget. Meanwhile, miles away in New York City, a billionaire named Richard Harrington was preparing for a private flight. Richard was powerful, rich, and used to having control over everything in his life, except for his 6-month-old daughter, Emily. She was beautiful, bright-eyed, but notoriously difficult to calm. Even the most expensive toys, the softest blankets, and the loudest lullabies often failed to soothe her. Today, he was flying to Los Angeles for a high-profile business meeting, and he had hired the best crew, booked first-class seats, and ensured every possible comfort was available. What Richard didn't know was that fate had already placed Jordan on the same flight. Jordan had won a small scholarship to visit a museum in Los Angeles with his school. He had never been on a plane before, and the excitement bubbled inside him like soda in a shaken bottle. He had no idea that his life was about to intersect with the richest man in the country, and his crying baby. The moment the plane took off, Emily started to cry. First, it was a whimper. Then, a shriek that seemed to shake the very walls of the aircraft. Richard's face turned red, his hands gripping the arms of his seat. Flight attendants rushed, offering bottles, pacifiers, and gentle rocking. Nothing worked. The baby's wails grew louder, piercing through the cabin like sirens. Passengers were annoyed, frustrated, and some even angry. Jordan, sitting a few rows behind, watched quietly. Something about the baby's cries tugged at his heart. He remembered Mrs. Evelyn's words, "A small act of care can change someone's day." Without thinking, he stood up, carefully making his way to the first-class cabin where Emily was screaming. His sneakers squeaked softly against the aisle, and some passengers glanced at him with curiosity. Then came the moment of truth, the moment that would define both his and Emily's lives. Jordan extended his hand. Trembling slightly, he touched the tiny hand of the billionaire's baby. The sound of crying slowed. Emily blinked at him, mesmerized. The plane's hum felt softer somehow. Richard's eyes widened, a mix of disbelief and gratitude flashing across his face. And just as the cabin began to relax, a sudden warning light flashed on the control panel. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing unexpected turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts immediately." The baby gasped. Her grip on Jordan's hand tightened. Drinks toppled from trays. Panic rippled through the cabin. And in that split second, with the plane shaking violently, everyone held their breath. Would Jordan's courage be enough? Would Emily remain safe? The story froze at that edge, leaving every heart pounding, every mind racing. The plane rocked like a toy boat on a stormy sea. Drinks splashed across trays, a few passengers gasped, and seatbelts clicked loudly as everyone tried to secure themselves. The hum of the engines seemed distant, replaced by the pounding of hearts and the sharp cries of the baby. Emily's tiny hands clutched Jordan's, her eyes wide and glimmering with both fear and trust. Richard's face was pale, and his usual confident demeanor had vanished. He had controlled boardrooms, corporations, and banks, but he could not control this. His daughter's tears were unstoppable. The flight attendants tried to soothe her, but even their gentle rocking and soft lullabies had little effect. Jordan, however, held steady. He had never seen a baby so frightened, and he could feel the tension in the cabin pressing on everyone's shoulders. But he remembered Mrs. Evelyn's words again. "A small act of care can change someone's day." He leaned slightly closer, speaking softly to Emily, his voice gentle but firm. "It's okay, little one. You're safe. I'm here." Emily's cries softened. Just a little, but it was enough to make a difference. Richard's eyes widened again, unable to believe what he was seeing. The billionaire had all the money in the world, but the courage and empathy of this small boy, someone who had almost nothing, was calming his child in a way no luxury could. As the turbulence continued, Jordan kept his focus. The baby's small fingers twitched against his rough hand, and he felt her tiny pulse racing. Passengers watched silently, some with skepticism, others with awe. No one had expected a child, especially one from a modest background, to become the hero of this moment. Once the plane steadied slightly, a flight attendant approached Jordan cautiously. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" she asked, her tone half incredulous, half relieved. Jordan nodded. "I just want her to feel safe," he said simply. There was no bravado, no expectation of reward, only kindness. Minutes passed like hours. The plane had not yet reached its cruising altitude, and the turbulence kept shaking it. Each jolt made the passengers grip their armrests tighter, and each shudder seemed to challenge Jordan's small frame. But he didn't let go. Emily's cries became quieter, turning into soft whimpers and then occasional gurgling noises. Richard finally spoke, his voice low and trembling. Who are you?" he asked. Jordan turned his head, giving him a small, honest smile. "Just someone who cares," he said. Simple words, yet they carried more weight than any billionaire's wealth or power. Somewhere in the back of the plane, an older woman sitting alone. Mrs. Whitaker, a retired nurse, watched Jordan with admiration. She whispered to herself, "That boy, he's got a heart stronger than most adults." The plane began to stabilize, and the passengers released some of the tension they had been holding. Emily finally allowed a tiny yawn, leaning her head slightly against Jordan's hand. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. The cabin let out a collective breath, relief washing over them in quiet waves. Yet even in that calm, the atmosphere remained charged. Richard's mind raced. He had always believed that money could solve everything, that wealth gave control over the world. But here, in the confined space of a plane, he realized that compassion and courage, qualities he often overlooked, were far more powerful. After a few minutes, the captain's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are through the worst of the turbulence. We are now ascending steadily. Thank you for remaining calm and keeping your seatbelts fastened." Passengers relaxed further, some exchanging nervous smiles. Jordan sat back down, Emily finally resting in her father's arms again. Richard held her gently, looking at Jordan with a mix of gratitude and confusion. He had expected chaos and discomfort, but instead, a small boy had saved the day. As the plane leveled off, Jordan's mind drifted back to Mrs. Evelyn's stories. He remembered the countless afternoons he spent listening to her tales of courage, empathy, and selflessness. Those lessons had shaped him, teaching him that it wasn't wealth, status, or power that defined a person. It was kindness, bravery, and the ability to connect with others, no matter who they were. Richard's attention shifted to Jordan again. "I need to know your name," he said, his voice steady now but filled with urgency. You've done something incredible." Jordan shrugged, a little embarrassed by all the attention. "It's Jordan Brooks," he said. His voice was soft, but there was pride in it. Emily gurgled again, and for the first time she seemed genuinely content. Her father's tension eased slightly, and even the flight attendants exchanged quiet nods of approval. Jordan had accomplished what none of the adults had been able to do. But the calm didn't last long. Somewhere outside the cabin, a low rumble shook the plane again. The lights flickered. A wave of unease passed through the passengers. The turbulence wasn't over. It had just returned, stronger this time. Drinks sloshed over the edges of trays, and some passengers gripped the seats so tightly their knuckles turned white. Jordan instinctively placed his hand near Emily again, ready to offer comfort. But this time, the turbulence was different. It wasn't the usual up and down shake. It felt as if the plane had hit something in the air. A sharp jolt sent a tray flying into the aisle, narrowly missing a passenger. Screams erupted once more, louder than before. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next powerful billionaire story. Richard's heart sank. He clutched Emily tightly, holding her close. Flight attendants ran up and down the aisles, shouting instructions over the rising panic. Passengers were panicked, some crying, some praying, all of them helpless. Jordan's eyes widened. He had helped Emily before, but now the danger seemed bigger, the stakes higher. He looked at the tiny baby in his mind and realized this was not just a test of empathy anymore. It was a test of courage, of quick thinking, and of the strength that comes from a pure heart. And then, just as the plane shuddered violently for the second time in a matter of seconds, a loud pop echoed through the cabin. A sharp smell of burning wires filled the air, and smoke began to drift from the ceiling vents. Passengers screamed in terror. Richard's face turned white, his mind racing. Emily's eyes widened in alarm, and she began to cry again, louder than ever. Jordan froze for a moment, realizing that everything had changed. The small act of kindness that had calmed the baby now had to compete with an actual emergency. The cabin was in chaos. The lights flickered, the oxygen masks dangled, and flight attendants shouted instructions while trying to remain calm. Every passenger looked around desperately for help. Jordan's hand hovered, unsure if he could reach Emily in time again. He took a deep breath, remembering Mrs. Evelyn's words. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was acting despite it. He made his choice. The story paused at the edge of disaster, the cabin filled with tension, smoke, and terror. Would Jordan be able to calm Emily again? Or was this turbulence the beginning of something far worse? Smoke curled from the ceiling vents, curling like gray snakes in the cabin air. The passengers panicked, clutching seatbelts, crying, shouting. Chaos reigned. The baby's cries, once calm in Jordan's hands, now screamed with fear and confusion. Richard held Emily tightly, his knuckles white, his mind racing for a way to protect her. Jordan's heart pounded, but he knew he couldn't freeze. He had calmed her before, and he could do it again. He took a deep breath, forcing his fear aside, and slowly reached toward Emily's tiny hand. Her eyes met his, wide and trembling, and for a split second, the noise of the cabin faded. "It's okay, Emily," he whispered. "I'm right here. You're safe with me." The baby's cries softened slightly, just enough for the adults around them to notice. Richard's astonished eyes flicked from his daughter to the boy. He had seen courage in boardrooms, in deals, in battles of money, but this was something different. Raw, unpolished courage. Empathy that had no price tag. The plane jolted again, stronger than ever, throwing some passengers against their seats. A loud bang echoed from the engines, and the overhead bins rattled violently. Flight attendants screamed, warning everyone to brace. Smoke thickened in the cabin, and oxygen masks began to drop. Jordan stayed focused. He held Emily's hand firmly, offering her the reassurance she needed, even as his own heart pounded with fear. Around him, passengers panicked, some screaming, some praying, some frozen in terror. But his small hand, steady and calm, became a lifeline, not just for Emily, but for the hope of everyone in that first-class cabin. Richard took a deep breath, trying to regain control. "Jordan," he shouted, his voice trembling but urgent. "We have to get her. Secure her before the oxygen masks." He leaned closer, realizing that the small boy was more than just a child. He was the reason his daughter still had hope. The turbulence grew worse. Drinks spilled, luggage tumbled from bins, and screams filled the plane. But Jordan didn't let go. Emily's tiny fingers gripped his, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, her sobs turned into soft whimpers. Every second counted. Every heartbeat mattered. Then came the moment that tested everyone's courage. A sharp alarm blared from the cockpit. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Attention passengers. We have an engine failure. Brace for emergency descent. Flight attendants, secure all passengers immediately." Panic erupted anew. Some passengers screamed, some fainted, and a few prayed out loud. Richard's mind raced. He had faced countless crises in his life, but nothing had prepared him for this. And yet, here was Jordan, a boy with no wealth, no status, no experience, doing what the most powerful adults in the cabin could not. Keeping a terrified baby calm. Jordan leaned closer to Emily. "It's okay, Emily. I'm not going anywhere," he whispered. His voice was calm, unwavering. "We're going to get through this." The plane began to descend rapidly. Oxygen masks dangled, smoke filled the air, and the roar of the failing engine rattled everyone's bones. Richard held Emily closer, shielding her from the chaos, and looked at Jordan with gratitude so deep it had no words. Flight attendants moved quickly, helping passengers secure masks, assisting those who had panicked, and trying to maintain order. The small cabin was filled with chaos and fear, but Jordan's presence, quiet, steady, compassionate, was a center of calm in the storm. Minutes passed like hours. The plane shuddered violently, then dipped sharply. Screams filled the cabin again, but Emily's hand stayed in Jordan's. Slowly, the baby's cries diminished, replaced by tentative gurgles and hiccups. Richard realized that while turbulence, smoke, and mechanical failure had shaken the plane, Jordan's courage had kept the most fragile life safe. Then, as the plane dipped into another sudden drop, a panel above their seats tore open, sending a small stream of sparks down into the aisle. Passengers screamed and ducked. The smell of smoke thickened. Jordan's heart raced, but he did not release Emily's hand. Instead, he whispered again, softly and firmly, "You're safe. I've got you." Richard, seeing this, felt a lump in his throat. He had always believed that money could protect his daughter, that power could control every danger. But this simple act of courage, empathy, and love had saved her in a way he never could with wealth. The plane shuddered one last time before the turbulence began to ease. The smoke cleared slightly, and the alarmed passengers clutched at their seats, breathing heavily. Emily rested her tiny head on Jordan's hand, finally calm, her tears drying. The cabin slowly quieted, though the tension lingered. Richard finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Jordan, I don't know how to thank you." Jordan shrugged, almost shyly. "I just wanted to help," he said. "That's all." Emily gurgled softly, reaching up to touch his face. Richard swallowed hard, realizing what had just happened. A small boy, a child from a poor neighborhood, had done what wealth, power, and experience could not. He had saved a life with courage and kindness. The flight attendants began to stabilize the cabin. Some passengers wiped their eyes, others muttered prayers under their breath. The plane, though damaged, was still in the air, and the passengers had survived the ordeal. But the lesson of the day was clear. Money and power could not replace empathy, courage, and the willingness to act in the face of fear. Richard looked down at Emily, asleep in his arms. Then he turned to Jordan. "You're going to meet people who will try to tell you that money or status define you," he said softly. "But today, you proved that the heart matters more than anything else in the world. You've changed her life, and mine, forever." Jordan blushed, looking at the floor. I just wanted to help," he repeated, more quietly this time. The rest of the flight was uneventful, but the story had already taken root. Passengers whispered among themselves about the boy who had calmed the billionaire's baby. Flight attendants spoke of courage in the face of fear. And Richard Harrington began to see the world differently. He realized that kindness, empathy, and bravery, qualities so often overlooked, were far more valuable than any bank account, property, or title. When the plane finally touched down safely in Los Angeles, Richard carried Emily off the plane. Looking back at Jordan, he extended his hand. "You're going to have opportunities in life, Jordan. But don't forget this moment. Don't forget how powerful kindness can be." Jordan shook his head. "I don't need anything," he said simply. "I just hope she's happy." Richard smiled, a genuine, warm smile, the first he had shown in a long time. He realized that the richest man in the world could learn from a poor boy with a kind heart. And as the passengers stepped onto the tarmac, still shaken but relieved, Jordan quietly walked back to his seat, thinking of Mrs. Evelyn's words. A small act of care can change someone's entire day, maybe even their life. Today, he had changed a life, and the world of someone he had never even met. In that moment, high above the clouds and then safely on the ground, the lesson was clear. Empathy, courage, and kindness are far stronger than fear, far more valuable than wealth, and far more powerful than anyone could imagine. And the baby? Emily finally smiled, tiny hands reaching for Jordan, as if saying thank you in the only way a child could. The plane had finally landed safely. Passengers stepped onto the tarmac, still shaken but filled with relief. Emily, the billionaire's baby, was now calm, her tiny fingers still clutching Jordan's rough hand. Richard Harrington carried her carefully, looking at the small boy with awe and gratitude. "You saved her," Richard said quietly, almost unable to find the right words. "I don't know how to thank you." Jordan shook his head, a shy smile on his face. "I just wanted to help. That's all," he said simply. Richard looked at him for a long moment, realizing something he had never understood before. Money could buy almost anything, but it could not buy courage, empathy, or a heart that truly cared. Jordan had reminded him what really mattered. Emily cooed softly, leaning her head against Jordan's hand one last time before yawning. Richard gently held her, understanding that the small boy's bravery had given them both a gift they could never repay. As Jordan turned to leave, he felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Richard, extending a card with a simple note. Your kindness changed our lives. Never forget it. R.H. Jordan looked down at it, feeling a warmth in his chest. It wasn't money, it wasn't fame, it was acknowledgement of something far more valuable. The power of kindness and courage. Back at home in Ohio, Jordan returned to Mrs. Evelyn's little house, telling her everything. She listened with a proud smile, nodding as if she had expected nothing less. "See, Jordan," she said softly, "a single act of care can change the world in ways you can't even imagine." And in that moment, Jordan understood. He didn't need to be rich or famous. His heart, his courage, and his kindness were enough to make a difference. He had calmed a billionaire's baby, faced fear in the skies, and reminded the world that the simplest acts of empathy could create miracles. As for Richard Harrington, he never forgot the boy who taught him the greatest lesson of all. Emily would grow up with stories of a small, courageous boy who calmed her in the storm, and every time she did, she would remember that true power comes not from wealth, but from the heart. And so the story ended, not with money, not with fame, but with the quiet, unshakable truth that even in the most frightening moments, courage and kindness could light the darkest skies. The world was forever changed that day by a boy named Jordan and a billionaire who learned that sometimes the richest people are those who give love without expectation, and the strongest heroes are the ones with the simplest hearts. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more emotional and powerful billionaire stories coming soon.